I presume you're here in order to learn of Magecraft. I'll have you know, there's no room for the weak-willed in this course, and despite your best efforts, the sorcery of our time is but a fraction of what it once was in the Age of Gods. Much of the craft is established through pedigree, and the culture of mages is riddled with deception and moral depravity. That said, if you insist, I shall do my best to educate you in this miserable, yet fascinating world. In our previous lesson, I spoke of necromancy, focusing on the mage Kairi Shishigo and the various spells and tools in his arsenal. I hope that it served as a satisfying example of how, despite united into one broad study of magecraft, the individual lives of mages can be quite different. To continue broadening our horizons, talking of magecraft on a macro scale, it's worth addressing the association's adversary, the Holy Church. Indeed, the Church inhibits and rivals the association's activities, while at the same time employing their own forms of magecraft. While not dedicated to the craft for the same reasons, it would be troublesome for a mage not to know more about the Church. In the most basic of terms, the Holy Church is a more ambitious and aggressive branch of the Roman Catholic Church. It consists of zealots who actively hunt and destroy heretics and those who threaten their religious sanctity. For this reason, many of the activities conducted by the Mages Association are seen as blasphemous. While mystery and magecraft themselves aren't against God, the applications they're used for conflict, creating a constant tension between the groups. Over the years, however, both the Association and Church have found ways to coexist, compromising on various issues such as the Holy Grail War, ensuring that all parties play a role. That said, this peace is fragile and informal, allowing for plenty of betrayal and corruption. Of course, the Holy Church has its own problems to deal with. They take an active role in confronting humanity's sins, which includes the hunting of vampires, a broad term referring to sentient beings compelled by vampiric impulse to suck the blood of humans. While animals or phantasmal beasts can be manipulated, controlled, or contained like livestock, vampires pose a significant threat in their ability to spread bloodlust to their human victims. Oftentimes, this animosity is extended to other blood-sucking races, such as the true ancestors and dead apostles. Much like the Clock Tower employs enforcers to hunt mages branded through sealing designation, the Church has a number of units that are sent to slay heretics and vampires, such as executors and the Burial Agency. Ironically, these hunters tend to struggle with their own lack of faith, taking to battle as a means of reaffirming it. This means hunters within the Church aren't necessarily different from common assassins. Their lives tend to be consumed by bloodshed rather than worship. As such, the ends justify the means, and to slay heretics, warriors of the Holy Church employ a branch of thaumaturgy known as sacrament. This includes conceptual weapons fit for assailing spiritual entities, which have thrived for so long that they've become one of the most stable theories of magecraft the world has to offer. The most iconic of these weapons are keys of providence. In order to purify their targets, they force natural laws back onto vampires, a process which involves opening a target's physical structure and locking it to its original form. You've no doubt seen their black keys, the long, thin blades that can be thrown or wielded to stab or slash opponents. While these blades are fair enough as physical weapons, they excel against spiritual foes with an affinity for evil, making them blades of purification more than simply tools for rending flesh. Oddly enough, their fame is not necessarily due to their frequency of use. Church executors often avoid using them as they are oddly weighted and difficult to handle. Rather, a few prominent executors wield them so magnificently that they become a symbolic weapon of the Church. Even so, the keys have their merits. For one, the blades themselves are generated through mana, allowing users to simply carry around their rudimentary hilts. In the hands of a truly masterful executor, such as Kirei Kotomine, the blades can be formed in just 0.3 seconds. While this makes them portable, another advantage is that the keys can be formed into different shapes and sizes. When thrown by skilled members of the Burial Agency, these mana-infused blades can penetrate reinforced concrete and strike foes like a speeding car. Devout believers can enchant black keys to perform various rites, causing enemies to burst into flames, become petrified, or even attract swarms of crows when struck. Ciel, for instance, can render foes immobile by piercing not their flesh, but their shadows. Shiro Kotomine, on the other hand, can alter the key's trajectory mid-flight by incanting the word set. While not all members of the church wield black keys, they are most certainly taught the baptism sacrament, a ritual meant for exorcising demons and wraiths. Shiro Kotomine uses this very ritual to destroy the legend of Dracula, sending the monster away through incineration in blue flames. Other conceptual weapons employed by the church are holy shrouds, the cloths once used to wrap around the saints. They serve to protect the wearer. As we discussed in relation to familiars, the church uses scriptures as the most powerful conceptual weapons in their possession, such as Nanako, the seventh holy scripture. They are noted to be able to defeat even divine beings. Again, just like the Association, the Holy Church has its own organizational system. The most basic of these are abbeys, religious homes that house practitioners, only allowing them to leave on occasion to hunt or exercise. Before being dispatched to Fuyuki, following the death of her father Kire, Karen Hortensia lived as a resident of the Sito Abbey. Mirroring the clock tower's various research branches, the Holy Church has the Assembly of the Eighth Sacrament, an agency of clerics who investigate and procure holy relics, such as crosses, the blood of saints, and other lost artifacts. As the name implies, these clerics follow an eighth sacrament of the Catholic Church, one that embraces the use of heretical powers if in service of God's glory. It is a hypocritical addition made so that the Church can compete with mages. While the lesser and greater grails of Fuyuki merely borrow the form and reputation of the genuine Holy Grail, the Assembly still treats it as one of hundreds of claims to the Grail, and supervise the wars in the event that the real thing does emerge. The Church extends itself to these wars exclusively for this reason, having absolutely no reason to covet the root. After all, the Church has its own ontological beliefs, which ignore the existence of space beyond the world proper, such as the reverse side or Akasha. When it comes to using the Grail, church overseers actually prefer mages waste its energy on reaching the root, rather than letting a potential sinner cause havoc on Earth. Needless to say, if the church knew Fuyuki's fire was the result of Kirei's wish, they certainly would not have allowed him to remain for the Fifth Grail War. A less devout branch of the Holy Church is the Burial Agency, a group founded by the priest Michael Roa Valdemyong, who later went on to become a powerful dead apostle. This agency is headed by Narbarek and her descendants, and is responsible for not purifying, but rather killing demons and heretics. As such, faith is not a requirement to join. All their members need to do is kill whatever and whomever the church finds troublesome. Essentially, the church has compromised its integrity for power, opening the agency up to all manner of psychopathic murderers and sinners, so long as they follow orders and produce results. This even means teaming up with strong blood-sucking heretics like Arcuate Brunstud in order to eliminate the less reasonable and more immediately threatening dead apostles. While mages are certainly no paragon of moral ideology, the mere existence of the Burial Agency seems to undermine the very values the Church should be upholding. This hypocrisy can best be seen in the torment of Elysia, a young French girl who found herself possessed by Michael Roa's next incarnation. Roa's influence consumed her, causing her to massacre her fellow villagers until Arcuate arrived and defeated Roa. Tragically, Roa is not killed so easily, instead continuing to reincarnate. As an effect of her possession, Elysia is rendered effectively immortal so long as Roa continues to exist. Interested in these powers, the Holy Church took her body and tested the limits of her regeneration, killing her countless times. Ultimately, it was decided that her powers made her a perfect candidate for the Burial Agency, and she joined under the name Ciel because she thought doing so would give her the chance to slay Roa, breaking her accursed immortality and finally ending her suffering. As if the Church couldn't get more radical, we have the Order of the Templars, a group that is not officially connected to the Church, but often works in tandem with it. Their heretic hunting efforts are on par with terrorism. The more official militant body of the Church are the chivalric orders, knights who defend what the Church deems holy ground. The shining star of this group is Riesbeif Striedberg, captain of the Vestal Shield Knights. She hunts vampires with a conceptual weapon called the True Apocrypha Gamaliel, another of the Holy Scriptures. As you can see, there is a divide between the more appalling hunters of the Church, who commit atrocities in the name of God, and the beloved priests who actually follow the Church's ideology. This is the gap between the executors and exorcists. These are roles more so than divisions of the Church, detailing the difference between killing heretics and attempting to save them. That said, successfully exorcising possessed humans without killing them is an extraordinarily rare feat, as most humans lack the strength of soul to withstand demonic corruption. Of course, there are exceptions, such as Karen Hortensia, who suffers from masochistic spiritualist disposition. When in the presence of possessed humans, she suffers the same effects, allowing her to be a radar of sorts in finding demons. Her life is one of suffering, sacrificing her own well-being for the sake of saving others. In summation, the Holy Church is a contradictory gathering of religious zealots who aim to eliminate all heretics who oppose their Lord. This includes the likes of demons, vampires, and other mages. Yet, despite condemning these heretics, members of the Church hypocritically embrace their methods in order to hunt them down. While there are those in the Church that genuinely follow their faith, attempting to exorcise and heal the afflicted, many are hired or brought on exclusively for their raw killing potential. They possess various deadly conceptual weapons, mystic codes, and holy scriptures that help preserve them as a major influence that no mage can simply ignore. Regardless of your own faith or ethics, there's no denying the prominence the Church has managed to achieve. In our previous lesson, I spoke of the Holy Church and its contradictory synthesis of murder and worship. While the Church often opposes the Mages Association, or perhaps because of this, I found it imperative to discuss, as no mage of worth should go without proper awareness. With that out of the way, I wish to resume more practical lectures, starting with requests from my more diligent students. Let it be known that you indeed have a voice, and I am ever attentive. Thus, for today's lecture, I wish to speak of bounded fields, and next time reality marbles, two similar yet fundamentally differing phenomena in terms of sheer potential. Thankfully, the concept of a bounded field is absurdly simple. It is a topographic magecraft, one that isolates part of the land from the rest through a knitted network of mana. The field separates what's inside from what's outside its boundary. Granted, nothing states that what's simple is in any way ineffective. Rather, bounded fields are one of the most prominent types of magecraft, both now and during the establishment of the association. After all, I've mentioned before that mages are not to interfere with the outside world, and that mages are an isolated community, not just from each other, but from the public at large. Thus, the bounded field's original use was to create safe havens, to protect and hide a mage's workshop and facilities. Mages can use them not only to guard themselves and their property, but also to hold private conversations and conduct rituals out in public without being noticed. Generally speaking, bounded fields are immobile once established, though exceptions do exist. The field, based on how it's weaved, designates how it affects both its interior and exterior, as well as its range and potency. That said, it is possible to enhance or expand a bounded field through the use of sigils placed within it. Inversely, this means that opposing mages can sabotage or weaken bounded fields by temporarily disabling these same sigils. To the creator's benefit, however, sigils can be repaired or restore themselves over time. The more advanced the technique used to weave a bounded field, the more difficult it is to disturb or dismantle. By this same token, the stronger the mage, the more likely their barrier will significantly affect weaker mages, phantasmal beasts, and even heroic spirits. Because of this, fields have a number of uses beyond protecting their creators, including offensive variants that function by interfering with the mana in the air and the ode of others. At the very least, it's important for these fields to remain hidden. A noticeable bounded field is a sign of incompetency for a mage. The practical applications for a bounded field are endless, so I will approach the topic by looking at specific examples, starting with the basics and working up to the more miraculous. By far the most traditional use is what is employed by the mage Toko Aozaki. Her establishment, Garan no Do, looks like a standard business from the outside, but on the inside contains a hoard of mystical artifacts, as well as her automata workshop in the basement. To deter onlookers and unexpected visitors, she makes use of a bounded field that hides the building's inner workings, protecting her from other mages as well as the public eye. Perhaps one might think of it as a Magecraft-induced security system. An even more rudimentary bounded field is implemented at the Emiya residence in Fuyuki, Japan. It forms a barrier around the estate that effectively sounds an alarm when people or potential threats enter it. While it does little to prevent visitors, it functions in giving Kiritsugu and his adopted son Shiro advanced warning when others approach them. In the very same town, we have Ryudo Temple, a place of worship built upon a mana ley line. This sort of location has a tendency to attract spiritual entities, despite their decline in recent generations. To keep these spirits at bay, the temple is surrounded by a powerful bounded field that repels them. It's so strong that even though servants can penetrate it, their abilities are significantly reduced in doing so. When the temple became a base of operations for Medea, she supplemented this field with one of her own, adding anti-sorcery effects and changing the interior to allow for her own Magecraft pursuits. While the ley line proves valuable in her practice, it also limits the range of her barrier. Completely enclosing the temple would also cut off the ley line's connection, rendering it useless. To allow for the ley line to flow, Medea's barrier has an opening that runs directly along the entryway, and she employs her own servant, Kojiro Sasaki, to manually guard this delicate area. Now, while heroic spirits demonstrate awesome abilities rooted in their legends, a handful of these skills are essentially bounded fields at their core. Most famously, there is Avalon, the scabbard of King Arthur's Excalibur. It is best known for granting Artoria Pendragon invincibility in combat. While the blade is a divine construct forged through the wishes of mankind, the scabbard functions as a bounded field that isolates its user within the domain of fairies, Avalon, the king's unreachable utopia. Its protection looks like a force field, but it's more like the user isn't even in the same world. The fairy's domain rejects outside interference, causing attacks to be reflected back outward. Avalon surpasses the might of even the 5 true magics, but still technically qualifies as a bounded field when utilized by Artoria in battle. Alas, this is not the only bounded field used by the King of Knights. When the need arises for her to conceal her true identity, the iconic appearance of her sword becomes an issue. Most anyone who sees it will immediately recognize it as Excalibur, in turn giving her away. To resolve this issue, she deploys Invisible Air, Barrier of the Wind King, a bounded field that isolates Excalibur from the outside world through layers of wind. The high concentration of mana and air obstruct the passage of light, effectively making the sword invisible. Of course, there is no hiding the sword when Artoria calls upon its true name, unleashing its golden light. Bounded fields don't necessarily have to hide their contents. Their defensive properties are valuable enough on their own. Legend tells of Ro Aias, the 7 rings that cover the fiery heavens, a shield implemented by Aias the Great during the Trojan War. The shield has a bronze base wrapped with 7 layers of oxhide, which provided Aias a suitable barrier to halt Hector's otherwise unstoppable spear, Durindana, enduring the strike at the cost of 6 layers. With the 7th intact, Ro Aias was conceptualized as the ultimate defense against projectiles. When invoked by heroes like Emiya, it appears as a 7-layer bounded field capable of enduring Cuchulain's devastating Gaybolg. Similarly, we have Achilleus Cosmos, the miniature world enclosed by the azure sky, the famed shield of Achilles, forged by the god Hephaestus. The shield protects its user from most all noble phantasms except for anti-world attacks, by sealing these oncoming attacks inside a miniature world. Essentially, to overcome the shield's might, an attack must first destroy this miniature world. During the Great Holy Grail War in Trephis, Achilles never actually invoked the shield, instead gifting it to Astolfo at the war's end. In turn, Astolfo uses the noble phantasm to isolate and cancel out Karna's deadly Vasavi Shakti. That said, not all bounded fields serve to protect. In fact, some are quite malicious, such as Medusa's Blood Fort Andromeda, Outer Seal Blood Temple. Medusa, in life, was exiled to the Shapeless Isle, living in a temple of blood where the sun could not reach. Through Medusa's mystic eyes of petrification, the temple was encased by a bounded field that, as the name implies, petrified intruders and sapped their life force. As a heroic spirit, Medusa is able to recreate this blood fort by using her own blood to place various magic circles around an area. Those inside the fort are conceptually within the range of her eyes, trapped within a crimson dome, and are drained of their mana. When fully invoked, with all its seals intact, the fort dissolves its victims, as though they were digested by a beast, reducing them to a murky red ooze. The fort isolates its victims from the outside world, preventing both intrusion and escape, and is strong enough to damage mana ley lines and sever communication between masters and their servants. Thus, the only way to survive is to force Medusa to disable the field. It requires 10 days to fully activate, and thankfully it failed to manifest during Fuyuki's 5th Holy Grail War. Due to the efforts of Shiro Emiya and Rin Tosaka, the blood fort only caused innocent victims to convulse and foam at the mouth. This may be morbid, but any stronger and their skin would start to melt. Even so, if one only wished to siphon mana discreetly, the fort could remain in its weaker state, nearly undetectable to non-mages. As if that weren't impressive enough, Medusa can also utilize the bounded field Breaker Gorgon, self-seal Dark Temple. This noble phantasm isolates victims in a traumatic nightmare filled with profound pleasure and abundant suffering. Offensively, it seals all magical properties, robbing victims of the abilities they had going into the fight. She relied on this noble phantasm on the Shapeless Isle after awakening as the monstrous Gorgon. The hero Perseus, however, confronted Gorgon prepared with his own bounded field, Kibisi's Bag of Barrier Inversion. This god-gifted noble phantasm is a field that isolates what's in the bag from the outside, with its potential being the ability to swap these inner and outer worlds. Thus, when Medusa unleashed Breaker Gorgon, attempting to seal Perseus in a nightmare, he invoked Kibisi's to reflect the nightmare back upon her. While the results are not always predictable, bounded fields can certainly clash in this manner. In addition to nightmares, Breaker Gorgon can also be used to seal targets in other kinds of dreams. Most prominently, she uses it to take advantage of mages, enacting dreams of a sexual nature to steal their blood and semen. Jack the Ripper has an equally nefarious bounded field, the Mist, darkened misty metropolis. Upon opening the shutter of an antique lantern, Jack encases an area of over a dozen meters in a swirl of mist, formed from mana and sulfuric acid. Ordinary humans who find themselves within this mist either faint from pain or suffocate from a burnt throat as they writhe in pain. This allows Jack to trap and slaughter her enemies, all the while keeping outsiders away. Even for servants, the mist robs them of their ability to see her. By far, the mage most skilled with bounded fields happens to be Soren Araya. While otherwise unremarkable, Araya stands out and derives strength from his bounded fields, particularly Rokudo Kyokai, or Threefold Barrier, a three-layered field created by chanting 6 names. He makes use of his origin, Stillness, to allow the bounded fields to freeze those within their range. Unlike most all other fields, this one is mobile, always surrounding Araya for his protection, as well as for combat. On a more grandiose scale, we have his Honoden Rokuju Yonsho, the 64 layers of the Hono Temple, which surrounds his workshop, the Ogawa apartment complex. Those who enter the complex and remain long enough find themselves driven to madness, repeating their sins in an endless cycle embodying yin and yang. It is Araya's true talent as a magus, which he uses in an attempt to reach the root. Earlier, I mentioned that bounded fields could only be completely dismantled by their creators, but there are some rare exceptions. For instance, bounded fields can be conceptually killed by those possessing the mystic eyes of death perception. Mystic blades, such as the Kanesada Kuji, can sever bounded fields simply from being removed from their sheaths. In the hands of Ryogi Shiki, this sword is able to cut through both the Threefold Barrier and Ogawa apartment bounded fields with ease. In summation, bounded fields are a form of magecraft that work by separating the world into what's outside and inside a weave of mana. The inside space can be hostile, protective, or otherwise hidden from the general public. This is great for mages who need to communicate or practice without being seen or invaded, and is also dangerous for those who aim to trap others for the sake of murder or twisted personal satisfaction. Next time, I plan to speak of reality marbles, which function in a similar manner, but are ultimately far more powerful. In our previous lesson, I spoke of bounded fields, a process where mages isolate a region of the land to establish separate conditions from what's outside and inside a boundary. This can include masking a location from the outside world, allowing mages to conduct their craft in privacy, but it can also be used to trap or harm invaders. While bounded fields can go as far as drastically warping the reality around them, creating other worlds in an isolated space, they are technically a step down from a more impressive feat, the reality marble. Thus, today's lesson shall be on reality marbles, covering what they are as well as looking into various practical examples. In simple terms, a reality marble is the pinnacle of all bounded fields. It isolates a region of the world and swaps it with one's inner world, a projection of their very soul. It follows the world egg theory, which involves switching the self and the world by enclosing the world in a small container and expanding the self to a massive scale. In practice, it appears as though users are able to abduct targets in a certain radius and seal them off from reality into their own materialized world. From the outside, it's as if the user and targets completely vanish. As such, it is a relative phenomenon. Those encased by the marble find the world around them swapped with the internal landscape of the caster. The part that is often difficult to grasp is what an internal landscape actually is. Personally, I find it easiest to compare to a conceptual weapon. Conceptual weapons take an idea, such as Avalon's protection of the fairies, and manifest in a tangible form, such as regenerative healing. Various mages and servants can develop such conceptual ideas as internal worlds engraved on their very souls. For some, it can be a dream or aspiration, and for others, an embodiment of legend. Either way, once activated, a reality marble places individuals in a world that follows its own predetermined rules. This includes changing the landscape, climate, physics, passage of time, and overall abilities of those trapped inside. Typically, as a reality marble is the manifestation of one's inner world, it makes sense that the one activating the marble benefits most from its rules. That said, reality marbles are not so transient that their rules are in constant flux. A caster cannot alter the rules at will, as one would in utilizing Marble Phantasm. For a reality marble, the caster is embracing themselves for all it's worth, both good and bad. Reality marbles are exceptionally powerful. While a mage can often sense one has been deployed, it requires tremendous strength to interrupt the process. The degree I'm referring to would be tantamount to a noble phantasm, such as Excalibur. Gilgamesh's Aya is also conceptually endowed with the ability to tear apart the fabric of worlds, making it ideal in disrupting reality marbles. Still, these examples are few and far between. Naturally, the world itself opposes the artificial nature of reality marbles. When not invoked by spiritual beings, the world aims to restore itself to prominence, forcing casters to pour vast amounts of mana to maintain their reality marbles in a stable fashion. As a consequence, most users can only maintain them for a handful of minutes. Not even the most powerful dead apostles could maintain one beyond the passing of a night. Thankfully, the benefits of a reality marble are so great that a few minutes are often more than enough time to take advantage of their power. Thus, reality marbles are considered to be the closest magecraft to true magic, without actually being considered miracles. Now, one might think this to be highly attractive to mages of the association, but, ironically, reality marbles are considered so dangerous that they've been labeled taboo. This is most likely due to reality marbles being most prominently used by dead apostle ancestors. As such, there are no formal studies of the craft within the Mages Association. Those who obtain reality marbles do so of their own life experiences and independent research. While rare, the one saving grace is that, should a mage finally obtain a reality marble, it is possible to pass the technique down to descendants. Even so, a reality marble is often very personal, that its form will be different depending on the user. By far, the most emblematic reality marble we have to reference is Unlimited Bladeworks, the noble phantasm utilized by Shiro and heroic spirit Emiya. Its existence is entirely dependent on Shiro's origin and affinity of sword. It's the source of his ability to project and reinforce, or rather trace, objects into existence. Emiya lived his life as a sword to protect others, and so his inner world is essentially a grand factory for creating countless blades. While not necessary for all reality marbles, Emiya invokes the Bladeworks by reciting a 10-count aria, a personalized poem of his inner struggles. Naturally, the words in this poem differ between Shiro and his counter-guardian self, in turn changing the marble's appearance. In either case, each line of the poem serves a different purpose, allowing Emiya to channel the Bladeworks without summoning it outright. This is how he is able to conjure blades like Kansho and Bakuya, or summon a barrage of blades to counter Gilgamesh's Gate of Babylon without the reality marble itself fully materializing. The Bladeworks have also been seen infesting Shiro's body as a weave of blades as a result of the reality marble being too powerful for him to control. His muscles turn to blades, which stitch his wounds with swords. Without a personal conviction and possession over the Bladeworks, these swords can potentially sprout from within his own body, killing him in an instant, or in time rendering his entire body a motionless mass of swords. Within the marble, Shiro has access to the knowledge Emiya gained of the world's most famous weapons, as well as how to use them, and the materials needed to reproduce imitations of them. Because of their obvious connection, Shiro is able to instinctively grow and adapt Emiya's techniques and mannerisms for himself while fighting within the reality marble. Even so, to manifest his own version of the Bladeworks, Shiro relies on Rin's help supplying him mana. While the Unlimited Bladeworks are a very specialized application of a reality marble, they serve to establish that individual properties from within the marble can be summoned outside of it, such as the case for Iskandar's Ionian Hetairoi, Army of the King. His internalized world is based on the shared ambitions of his entire army, effectively sealing enemies in a vast plain where they must face thousands of masterless servants. While deadly when fully invoked, Iskandar needn't deploy the entire reality marble, and may instead opt to take from it individual soldiers for a time. The Ionian Hetairoi was used to slay Hassan of the Hundred Faces, and to trap Gilles de Rais's Lovecraftian monster. As expected, this takes a toll on Iskandar, such that his master Waver must sleep for days at a time to replenish his stamina. In addition to the Bladeworks and the Ionian Hetairoi, let us take the time to explore other reality marbles mages have encountered, such as the Airavata king-size colossal figure, Emerge from the Sea of Life, a noble phantasm harnessed by the servant King Protea on Earth. She is a giant, and so the counterforce typically pressures her into a smaller size. Her reality marble overcomes this, allowing her to manifest in full form whilst inside. The servant Scheherazade wields the Alflaya Walaya, 1001 Nights, a reality marble that manifests all sorts of characters and elements that appear in her narrations. King Solomon's Grand Temple of Time is, in itself, a reality marble called Ars Paulina. It separates his workshop within the space of imaginary numbers, allowing for the 72 demon god pillars to revive so long as the temple remains intact. Queen Maeve is as skilled as she is wicked. Her noble phantasm, Chariot My Love, My Dear Iron Chariot, is a reality marble where the inside is her love nest. None can escape until Maeve has properly had her way with them. BB's Cursed Cupid Cleanser also counts as a reality marble. While she injects her enemies with a massive syringe, she does so within the confines of her egotistical BB channel. When a Visebron completes his golem Kater Malkuth, a giant primordial atom, the golem's every step swamps the world with Visebron's vision of the Garden of Eden. La Pucelle, the Crimson Saint, is a noble phantasm belonging to Jeanne d'Arc. By invoking her sword, Saint Catherine, Jeanne transforms the world around her into an interpretation of her burning at the stake, unleashed as a devastating flame attack. A rare twist on the reality marble can be seen with the servant Nursery Rhyme, for she is in fact a reality marble, embodying nursery rhymes collectively into a servant. Alice, the master, forms desires from reading nursery rhymes, giving birth to a servant that can impose upon the world places and creatures from Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Grand Surg Blackmore, the 16th of the dead apostle ancestors, can implement a reality marble called Nevermore, which swallows the light of the moon and stars, shrouding it in darkness as a world of death. He used it to claim his seat as the 16th, massacring a clan of over 100 vampires. The mage turned dead apostle ancestor, Michael Roa Valdemyong, is able to enhance his numerology magecraft through the use of a reality marble called Overload, which effectively doubles the output of his spells. Then there's the phenomena known as Tatari, a curse that grants physical shape to fears and rumors within a community. Rather than replacing a part of the world with an entirely different one, Tatari replaces the world around it with a similar one fueled by society's collective paranoia. Its power grows the more people's fear is intensified, and can be deployed for an entire night by the dead ancestor Knight of Wallachia. 10th of the ancestors is the horror known as Nero Chaos, infamous for having a stockpile of malicious beasts constantly bursting from his own body. This is thanks to his reality marble, Lair of the Beast King. Rather than imposing the marble out onto the world, he deploys it within himself, channeling a world filled with the creatures he absorbs. The servant Oda Nobunaga's noble phantasm Papias, Demon King of the Sixth Heaven, is a reality marble that shrouds the world in a scorching hell, where she can unleash the might of her vicious reputation. The Mooncell's serial phantasm, or Seraph, is actually a network of reality marbles, imposing onto virtual space various locations, such as the dungeons for the Mooncell Holy Grail War. The vampiric Satsuki Yumizuka deploys a reality marble called Depletion Garden, trapping victims in an inner world where the mana surrounding them dissipates drastically. Lastly, we have Charles Babbage's Dimension of Steam, Gorgeous World of Ashes, a noble phantasm that imposes a world in which Babbage's brilliant steam engine is finally completed. It is a steam-driven utopia of sorts, wherein Babbage can create autonomous machines based on his own armor. In summation, reality marbles are a supreme form of bounded field that separates part of the world and swaps it with the internal landscape of its user. In practice, it often appears as though casters are abducting victims and whisking them away to a world to their disadvantage. Because they violate the world we inhabit, deploying reality marbles is extremely costly, but also devastatingly powerful. Oftentimes, the marble itself need not be deployed entirely, as mages and servants can draw individual aspects from them, such as weapons, soldiers, or other mysteries. The odds of a mage having a strong enough inner vision and knowing how to deploy it are exceptionally low, leaving them mostly in the domain of dead apostles, heroic spirits, or mages with highly personal circumstances and aspirations. Much more common and tangible is the process of creating homunculi. Thus, next time, I plan to speak of homunculi, covering the history behind them, the process of making them, and the mixed results of doing so. In our previous lesson, I spoke of reality marbles, the realization of a mage or servant's mental landscape. They are certainly one of the more extraordinary aspects of the craft, and for contrast, it is time to cover something more mundane, yet no less significant. Of course, I refer to the creation of homunculi. While the deepest depths of alchemy are primarily studied within the Atlas Institute, certain mage families apply the craft in its basic application of manipulating the flow of matter. One aspect of this happens to be the creation of life without the need for a womb, using sperm and various elements as a foundation. In some ways, this is most controversial. Homunculi are very much alive, but depending on the methods used to create them, their existences have various limitations placed upon them. As such, to many mages, they are seen as subhuman, unworthy of the same treatment granted to biological humans, which for mages is already questionable as is. Thus, we have plenty to discuss, from the creation and application of homunculi to their ethics. Simply put, a homunculus is a being created through alchemy rather than sexual reproduction, though the matter is certainly more complex. Similar to golems, homunculi can be either basic or increasingly human depending on the skill and technique used to make them. Oftentimes, the goal is to perfect the craft, but every ideal homunculus typically emerges after significant trial and error, resulting in some that appear to be no more than mindless monsters. Even the most human-like homunculi tend to have at least one debilitating flaw, a cost of sorts for their birth through artificial means. These defects can range from diminutive stature, limited intelligence, and an inability to reproduce. Most commonly, however, a homunculus's greatest flaw is a short lifespan. The age depends on the type of homunculus, but some may only live as long as a couple of months or years. The idea of any one homunculus surviving more than 2 decades is but a pipe dream. Part of this comes from the basic philosophy of making homunculi. They are frequently made for the incredible magic circuits they possess. As such, rather than artificial humans grown to have magic circuits, homunculi are thought of as magic circuits crafted into a human form. The main incentive for making one human isn't necessarily to grant life. Rather, a living magic circuit proves to be far more useful, capable of protecting itself with limited autonomy. Because of this, even while looking human, homunculi are only as intelligent and autonomous as they need to be. Much of their brains are developed at the time of their creation, with no need to mature over many years like actual humans. A homunculus may look adult and composed, and yet only be a couple of years old. Much of their intelligence comes at birth, with many homunculi being born pre-programmed to serve a certain function, at least in theory. Others are made as a completely blank slate, with a naive child's mind. While this makes them easy to coerce, their development can often stray down a dark path. This is not to say a homunculus cannot develop a sense of self, a will of their own. Rather, such a phenomenon is often undesirable or inconvenient for the mages who make them. This is where ethics come into play. Is it in any way acceptable to create life for ulterior motives and expectations? Compared to familiars, homunculi have a higher degree of sentience, and yet some mages treat them the exact same. They are used as instruments and later disposed of as junk. Any that are considered failures are scrapped before they even have a chance to live their brief lives or serve their function. Even worse, they are born not to value their own will, leading many to never consider what it's like to have autonomy. While homunculi normalize this behavior, making them even easier to exploit, some say their abuse is wrong because, when given a glimpse of freedom, a taste of their potential, homunculi embrace the will to live and survive for their own sake. Thankfully, plenty of mages aren't even capable of creating homunculi. The Tosaka family, for instance, lacks the necessary alchemic knowledge. Still, there are quite a few examples of notable homunculi in the mages that created them. Most famously are the Einsburn homunculi. This family is most interesting because, over time, their family heirs actually became homunculi. They propagate more of themselves in an effort to perfect their form, and some 200 years ago they succeeded with the homunculus Justiz Liedrich von Einsburn. She was influential for being exceptionally human-like, sharing the Einsburns' desire to reclaim their lost magic of Heaven's Feel. In that effort, she used her own body as the base for Fuyuki's Greater Grail. Having reached a pinnacle achievement, all newer Einsburn homunculi were created using Justice as a model. The presumed benefit of this process was so that subsequent homunculi could inherit a record of her consciousness, understanding her ambitions and pain intrinsically. One of these Justice-type homunculi was sighted during the Third Holy Grail War, meeting her end in the conflict. This forced the family to confront its weakness, that in exchange for their alchemic prowess, able to grow impressive specimens, they lacked a significant fighting force. Thus, to gain a competitive edge for the Fourth Holy Grail War, the family sought help from a foreign magus, Kiritsugu Emiya, and created a new homunculus to assist him. She was developed to be a fully functioning human who could serve as the Lesser Grail's vessel. In other words, a living grail of sorts. This homunculus, Irisveal, was to help Kiritsugu in winning the Grail War, and yet, when she emerged from her tube, she lacked a fundamental understanding of the world, prompting Kiritsugu to doubt her abilities. She was cast into the forest as a trial, which only frustrated Kiritsugu more, so he rescued her and personally taught her of the modern world. Over 9 years, she absorbed his lessons and began to provide her own insights. She had become her own person, earning Kiritsugu's affection. Naturally, this was not a love that could last. For Kiritsugu to win the Grail War, Irisveal would have to be sacrificed. Airi did not wish to leave Kiritsugu alone through her demise, and proposed conceiving a child to provide him hope for the future. Thus, Irisveal became the very first homunculus to give birth as a human mother. This gave her life purpose and fulfillment that none had anticipated. Entrusting the future to her husband, Irisveal fought valiantly in the war, ultimately transforming into the Grail's vessel in her death. Her daughter, Iliasveal, was expected to grow up under Kiritsugu's care, but since he rejected the Grail, effectively betraying the Einsburns, he was barred from their manor. As such, Ilia was raised to be a competitor and Grail vessel for the Fifth War that would begin 10 years later. This was a perilous process. Even in Airi's womb, Ilia was put through magical experiments and modifications to improve her potential as a mage. Denied access to her father, she was further processed, incurring horrible wounds and cuts in an effort to expand her magic circuits. As a result, Ilia became immensely powerful at the expense of her childhood, well-being, and physical growth. Despite being in her late teens, Ilia's body is stuck in a prepubescent stage. No matter what fate awaits her in the Fifth Grail War, her brief life will end just years later. Ultimately, however, Ilia was considered a tremendous success, a miracle to have been born between a homunculus mother and a human father. Over the Einsburns' history, a myriad of other attempts to make superior homunculi were made, and none of them could match her. 2 of these failures were the homunculi Lisrit and Sella. They were spared from being scrapped in order to serve as Ilia's bodyguard and teacher, respectively. Lisrit in particular was modified to protect Ilia, enhancing her combat prowess at the cost of her ego. While there is definitely a person beyond her blank gaze, she is socially inept. Treated as an instrument, Lisrit's final task is to one day transform into the dress of heaven, a precious Einsburn mystic code needed to realize heaven's feel. Sella, on the other hand, was spared such fate, instead maintaining her intellect for the sake of Ilia's tutelage. In a completely separate context, the Einsburns created a homunculus named Philia to represent them in the False Holy Grail War. She managed to summon the true berserker Humbaba, and her body was ultimately possessed by the goddess Ishtar. Mirroring this idea of homunculi recreating themselves, we have Koharu F. Riedenfloss, the family representative in the Holy Grail War tournaments. The Riedenfloss family excels in creating homunculi, and Koharu is one of their creations. Naturally, from success comes envy, and thanks to the fame of Einsburn homunculi, other mage families try to replicate their theories. One such family is the Yggdrasil Millennia, more specifically their adopted alchemist Gord Muzik. He uses techniques stolen from the Einsburns to create homunculi that pale in comparison. Rather than quality, Gord focuses on quantity, creating a massive army of short-lived homunculi that either fight as soldiers in the Great Grail War, or are consumed as a source of mana for Yggdrasil Millennia's servants. Gord thinks very poorly of his creations, going so far as to name one of them Tool. While he acknowledges his inferiority, he knows his creations can still serve a purpose despite their flaws. Problem is, that purpose comes at their own expense. Through actual case study, it is impossible to deny that these homunculi suffer when killed on the battlefield or absorbed for their mana. The most potent of Gord's homunculi is Sieg. He is physically weak, but has magic circuits potent enough to serve as the core of a Visebron's golem Kater Malkuth. Before this became his fate, however, Sieg was able to break free of his tube and escape the Yggdrasil Millennia castle. Even though he and his fellow homunculi were mass-produced to have limited individuality, Sieg could sense the suffering of his kin, and took to the war as a master in order to liberate them. Mages such as Gord are lucky that the Association has no legislation on the fair treatment of homunculi, and that society at large doesn't know of their existence at all. Society does have legends, however, detailing the achievements and horrors of famous mages described throughout history. Included among them, we cannot help but mention one of the fathers of alchemy, Paracelsus von Hohenheim. During the Renaissance period, Paracelsus researched both medicine and alchemy, popularizing his findings to such an extreme that he was assassinated to keep the craft from entering mainstream awareness. As a heroic spirit, Paracelsus can create miniature homunculi of himself, made to follow specific tasks rather than think freely. Then there is the monster of Victor Frankenstein, a unique homunculus created to be an artificial incarnation of the biblical Eve. Her creator had bizarre expectations for her, considering she consisted of patched-up flesh given life through lightning. What should have been a story of success turned to tragedy as Victor saw his creation as a naive abomination. He did nothing to teach her, and so she had the mind of an infant. She lacked a moral compass because he refused to provide one. In that sense, he truly did create a monster. Yet, after being abandoned, the girl chased after him and, in doing so, learned of complex emotions. Most of all, she learned of love, and held Victor responsible for providing her with a mate. Her request was earnest, and still she was denied until they both found death. As a heroic spirit, Frankenstein's monster considers herself separate from the homunculi of the modern era, incompatible with the mate she coveted in life. Is she being shallow in this regard? Such a complicated matter is bound to be resolved through equally complex emotions. Perhaps, ultimately, love cares not for such restrictions. As an instructor of Magecraft, however, I hardly have the right to comment. While the literary work of Faust introduces Mephistopheles as a cynical demon, in truth, the wicked figure is an advanced homunculus created by Dr. Faust himself. In contrast to Frankenstein, Faust actually cared for his own creation, only to have that compassion betrayed. Faust is suspected to have been killed in a bombing incident caused by Mephistopheles. As with all conscious beings, the development of an ego must be carefully nurtured, else one grows to consider others toys for their amusement. My personal favorite homunculus happens to be Mordred, the clone of King Arthur. In an attempt to sabotage her sister's reign, the witch Morgan Le Fay infiltrated the king's chamber and absconded with her seed. Morgan used Artoria's genetic legacy to create a homunculus she could manipulate into sparking rebellion. The result was Mordred, who greatly resembled Britain's king. Again, however, she was not reared with compassion, instead taught by Morgan to hate her king. Despite this, Mordred developed her own emotions, which included an admiration for Artoria. Sadly, this is an admiration that ultimately turned against her. Unable to obtain her father's approval, Mordred inevitably carried out Morgan's will regardless, as her rebellion ended with both the king's death and hers. Even more tragic is that, as a result of her rapid growth, Mordred was fated to die before long regardless. With all these things considered, it's intriguing to look at how the Atlas Institute handles homunculi. In worlds containing the moon cell, mana is scarce, and Magecraft fades in prominence. Thus, instead of developing homunculi with circuits able to channel mana, Atlas uses a cloning process to create them with circuits capable of manipulating the moon cell's virtual world. We've discussed her before, but the most iconic of these Atlas homunculi is Rani VIII, created by Selim Eltna Riatlasia to carry on humanity's legacy in a cyber world. Due to this, she is not made from organic matter, but rather nano-sized fibers of ether light with intelligence fostered to rival the moon cell's own AI. Finally, we have a homunculus who is not thought of as a lesser being, but rather mankind's advancement into the future. In summation, homunculi are living beings created not through sexual reproduction, but rather the alchemic fusing of genetic materials with other resources to create artificial life. Due to the difficulty in mastering this art, most homunculi emerge with significant defects, leading mages to see them as lesser species despite their powerful magic circuits and often superhuman abilities. I am inclined to include them among all other living creatures of the earth, which ironically means subjecting them to the same inhumane antics as other mages. After all, no living things are spared when a mage disregards common social conventions in favor of wisdom and might. Perhaps to continue discussing the misery of sentient life, our next topic shall be on all manner of curses, including the Celtic Geis. In our previous lesson, I spoke of homunculi and the ethical dilemma that surrounds their use. Continuing in that vein, I wish to cover an undeniably less ethical type of spell. That is, I wish to speak of curses. In essence, curses refer to all manner of dark magecraft that taint, corrode, or otherwise plague targets with malicious effects. They are often utilized to punish or restrict victims with dangerous or painful consequences. Ironically, despite the cruel nature of the average mage, the Mages Association doesn't officially teach such spells, instead leaving much of their practice to the Middle East, as well as one of the more insidious applications of witchcraft. From a practical standpoint, consider curses to be the inverse of blessings. While one bolsters the strength of a target, enhancing or healing them, the other is meant to weaken them. To that end, a great many spells and styles of magecraft count as curses, and I feel it is best to teach through example, starting with perhaps the most horrific of them all. Angra Mainyu, a poor wretch from a Zoroastrian tribe, was declared by his peers to be the source of all evil, made a scapegoat to take on the sins of humanity. As part of his torture, the villagers carved upon him all manner of cursed words, resulting in a curse that truly forced him to represent such evils. Thanks to the collective scheming of the Ainsburns, Angra Mainyu was summoned as a heroic spirit to fight during the Third Holy Grail War in Fuyuki, and his defeat caused the Grail itself to become a cursed vessel that wickedly distorts wishes and spews toxic mud. This black ooze corrupts servants, shifting their alignment toward malice, and places all manner of unknown curses on mortals who come into contact with it. One tragic victim of this mud was Kiritsugu Emiya. At the end of the Fourth Grail War, he earned the opportunity to commune with the Grail, and upon seeing its true nature, he rejected it. As consequence, he was cursed by Angra Mainyu, slowly eaten away by regret until meeting an early death. In contrast, there are those who thrive upon curses, accepting their wickedness as a form of power. Kire Kotomine, also soaked in the Grail's mud, allowed it to grant his wish for destruction, unleashing a devastating fire throughout the city. The aftermath of that war had Zokin Mato implant fragments of the Lesser Grail into Sakura, forcing her to endure Angra Mainyu's corruption during the Fifth War. Combined with her hollow element, Sakura began to manifest a cursed shadow called the Cursed Boundary Layer, which would haunt Fuyuki at night by teleporting around and consuming various citizens and servants alike. While not quite the same, it is similar to a reality marble, a world turned inside out by hatred. The Moon Cell's own Sakura variant, BB, can implement an equivalent phenomena called the Cursed Cutting Crater. By utilizing Potnia Theron, the authority of various Earth goddesses, she can purge the entire world, eroding it into imaginary space. As far as servants go, Angra Mainyu is not the only heroic spirit to embody the idea of a curse. False Rider, also known as Pale Rider, was described in legend as a curse of death, and as such, manifests in a form fitting of the title. Typically, however, curses fall under the practice of witchcraft, where black mages conjure spells considered too nefarious for general practice. Alice Kuonji is one such mage who specializes in spells themed after fairy tales. Her various mystic codes have the capacity to curse victims, such as Tweedledee and Tweedledum, autonomous familiars whose jaws are scissor-like. They invoke a conceptual curse that can restrain targets, such as the puppets used by Toko Aozaki. Another of these devices is Scratch Dumpty, a time bomb in the shape of an egg. On its surface, a poem is inscribed over time, and once complete, it curses victims such that they cannot escape its explosive might. The inexperienced mage Ayaka Sajo also practices an old form of witchcraft involving plant manipulation and black feathers. While Ayaka's attacks are direct, there are more stealthy means of inflicting curses. An expert in this happens to be the caster servant Paracelsus von Hohenheim. He specializes in curses and can inscribe them onto magi unnoticed. Using this talent, he betrayed his master of the Rei-Rokan family and placed upon their daughter Misaya a curse that would kill her if she tried to abandon the Grail War. While she indeed participated, the curse ultimately took her life, transforming her corpse into a deranged zombie called a Fallen. Curses often share roots with Asian disciplines as well. In Japan, the legend of Tamamo no Mae describes her untimely death and transformation into the Seisho Seki, or Killing Stone. Those who approach the stone are said to suffer from a cursed poison, threatening passers-by until the monk Geno Shinsho stepped in to disperse the stone into 3 fragments. As a heroic spirit, Tamamo makes use of curses in addition to her martial arts. One such curse is called Thunderclap, which she uses to restrain Elizabeth Bathory. With a more Western bias, there is Mephistopheles, another servant practitioner of witchcraft. His demonic alignment allows him to implement spells that reflect his damage back on enemies and impose nightmares via incubi. This is a trend, actually. Deviant users of curses benefit from them most as though they were boons. For instance, dead apostles and true ancestors benefit from their curse of restoration, which functions as a limited form of immortality. Its curse is a matter of perspective. For some, eternal life is cause for celebration. For others, it is eternal suffering. Most assassins possess a skill for presence concealment, allowing them to sneak up on their enemies. King Hassan, however, carries a curse which causes his targets to sense their impending doom as he approaches them. That said, it doesn't seem to impede on his success. In some ways, curses can be thought of as righteous. Hanam, or Hassan of the Cursed Arm, invokes a curse that wards off harsh desert winds. By cursing the wind djinn, he and other practitioners can protect themselves over long journeys. Of course, this is in direct contrast to his arm, which happens to be the arm of Shaitan that curses humans to their death. In Hassan's case, the arm is able to duplicate and crush the hearts of his victims. Indeed, curses can be beneficial for the mages who implement them, but for every curse used, there is someone who suffers from its effects. The mage Kairi Shishigo, for instance, is the victim of a curse that occasionally activates within his family. It prevents him from producing children, serving as a death sentence not for him, but his lineage. More dramatic is the curse that Vali's wife placed upon the hero Rama, preventing him from reuniting with his beloved Sita for the remainder of his life. Even after he is able to rescue her, Rama would continue to pass by his love, only being able to embrace each other upon ascending to the heavens. Sadly, as a heroic spirit, this curse still lingers. The Edelfelt family are specialists with a simple Scandinavian curse known as Gundo. While it has no associated letter, Gundo is still classified as a form of rune magecraft, but functions in the form of mana shots fired from one's finger that, upon impact, ail the health of their victims. As heir to their respective families, both Rin Tosaka and Luvia Edelfelt are adept in firing Gundo shots, and necromancers like Kairi can invoke the curse through severed fingers. The mage heiress Utsumi of Mosaic City can use a more powerful variant of Gundo, known as Freischütz, based upon the German legend of Der Freischütz, told through literature and opera. More specifically, she fires off 7 bullets, the first starting as a standard Gundo, with each successive shot being stronger than the last. The final bullet, however, is cursed, to take both her life along with the target's, so she avoids this fate by reloading prior to unleashing the 7th shot. Despite all of these applications for curse spells, perhaps it was a wise decision for the Mages Association to stay clear of them. Perhaps we as a species would be better off without curses altogether. The reason I say this is that curses played a part in what nearly ended our world. When the demon god Hivemind Getia took over Solomon's body, he tried to enact the true Grand Order, a process of incinerating human history as fuel to travel back to the origin of mankind and reshape the very nature of humanity. To pull this off, Getia needed various pillars throughout history, and utilized a curse within the magic crests of select mage families to turn key mages into demon gods. Thus, certain mages such as Makiri Zolgin and Lev Liner were cursed by their bloodline into becoming detonation points for Getia's incineration of humanity. That said, speculating on the absence of curses is quite fruitless. They are here, for better or worse, inevitably being a detriment to someone. In the case of the Celtic warrior, Diarmuid Dubna, there were both pros and cons. Diarmuid was cursed with a beauty spot upon his face that inevitably charmed all women who looked upon it. While this may seem like a blessing, Diarmuid himself was a loyal knight in service to his captain, Finn McCool. He would never actively betray his lord, and yet his love spot forced him to do just that. In the days leading up to Finn's marriage to Lady Granier, Diarmuid's love spot captivated the fair maiden into disloyalty. The resulting affair permanently stained Diarmuid's loyalty, with Finn bearing enough resentment to allow him to die to wounds inflicted by a demon boar. At the same time, Diarmuid wielded a cursed spear called the Gay Buida, the Yellow Rose of Mortality, which inflicted wounds that could not be healed. In Fuyuki's Fourth Holy Grail War, it was used to deprive the King of Knights use of one of her arms, and no form of magecraft could repair the damage until after the spear was destroyed. Similarly, another Celtic hero, Cuchulainn, wielded the Gay Bolg, a lance forged from the bones of a creature known as the Cureid. Just like the Buida, the Gay Bolg also inflicts wounds that cannot be healed, though invoking its true name means inevitably piercing the target's heart for an instant death regardless. Legends from this part of the world also include a specific kind of curse known as a gesh, which is more akin to a cursed contract of sorts between two parties. They are important enough that I've deemed them worth their own unique lesson. Thus, in summation, curses are a wicked variant of Magecraft that the Association avoids teaching. Despite this, all manner of curses can be found throughout the world, each functioning by condemning one party at the expense of another. Opposite to blessings or boons, curses bring misfortune through suffering or restriction. They are most effective when used by mages wicked enough to embrace their effects sincerely. Yet, at the same time, not even the darkest of mages are immune to their reach. This lesson shall continue, resuming the topic so that we may further delve into Geis and their conditional nature. In our previous lesson, I spoke of curses and their many applications. Of all types of Magecraft, curses may be the most contextual and diverse, coming in forms that bring benefit or detriment to both their users and targets. In that regard, curses are akin to magical contracts, and as it turns out, one such form of curse is essentially just that. Of course, I speak of the Geis, a curse that conditionally binds people according to rules laid out beforehand. Essentially, a Geis is either an agreement made between two parties that restricts one's actions, or a forced condition placed upon one party by another. Think of them like self-imposed limiters or bindings, or if you'd prefer, weaker forms of command spells for servants. They tend to be more imposing and drastic than a typical curse, requiring reasonable preparation. As with other curses, the reasons mages would bother using them vary, and it is best to look at such cases through individual examples. Most frequently, Geisha are featured in Celtic mythology as an oath between warriors that, if broken, would curse the violator. Specifically, Geisha frequently occur within legends of the Ulster cycle. During this time, the Ulster king Crowhor, in a fit of lust, planned to marry the fair maiden Deirdre when she was merely a child, despite a prophecy declaring that doing so would bring peril to his kingdom. Deirdre, not wanting to wed a man old enough to be his father, instead fell in love with Noisha of the Red Branch Knights. Defying the king, Deirdre placed a gash upon Noisha, compelling him to elope with her. Crowhor's uncle Fergus, while escorting the happy couple back to Ulster as a sign of peace, was compelled by one of his own Geisha, a vow to never refuse a feast. This was, in fact, a ploy by Crowhor to lower Noisha's guard and steal back Deirdre. By taking advantage of Fergus's Geis and betraying his people's trust, Crowhor lost the loyalty of many brave warriors who joined Ulster's enemy, Connacht. When Connacht invaded Ulster during the cattle raid of Cooley, Fergus finally had his chance to slay Crowhor, but lost the opportunity when his former pupil, Cuchulainn, opposed him. Understanding Fergus's rage, Cuchulainn formed a Geis with his mentor that would force him to either stand down or immediately lose to Fergus's weapon Caladbolg should they ever have a rematch. Effectively, it was a warrior's promise not to interfere again. Even so, Cuchulainn had his hands full fighting against Connacht and its queen Maeve. While not technically a Geis, the warriors of Ulster suffered from a different yet equally devastating curse. Crowhor's degeneracy brought about the curse when he forced a pregnant woman, Macha, to prove her speed in a race against his fastest horses. With her life on the line, Macha won by the length of her belly, but the strain caused her to give birth to 2 stillborn children. Resentful of all the Ulster warriors who refused to help her, she cursed them to suffer intense labor pains whenever they were most needed on the battlefield. Because of this, Cuchulainn, technically not born within Ulster's domain, was one of the only warriors able to stand up to Maeve's army. One could say that Geisha played a significant role in this war. One of these Geisha forced both armies to fight only one-on-one duels each day. Cuchulainn, capable of felling 5,000 troops per day, agreed to only have one battle at a time, and in exchange, Maeve could only advance her army during these duels. Tragically, Maeve was able to take advantage of Geisha to pin Cuchulainn into a corner. There are times when, in order to follow one Geis, another must be broken. Such is the case when Cuchulainn has to either violate his Geis of never eating dog meat, a pledge he made in recompense for killing a lord's dog, and his Geis of never refusing food offered to him by a woman. In this case, a woman serving him dog meat is all it took to break one of his 2 Geisha, and as penance, he was deprived of his strength. Cunningly, or perhaps shamelessly, Maeve continued to turn Cuchulainn's Geisha against each other until he could no longer fight, meeting his defeat on the battlefield. In Celtic lore, Geisha tend to have ironic consequences. Before the cattle raid, for instance, Cuchulainn placed 3 Geisha on his unborn son Conla. This child was thus barred from turning back on a journey, resisting a fight, or giving his own name. Years later, Konla encountered his own father, and because of the geisha placed upon him, he could neither reveal his identity nor back out of a fatal duel. This forced him to fight his own father to the death, unable to clear up the misunderstanding. Due to the very same geisha he imposed, Cuchulainn accidentally killed his own son. Celtic geisha have also been found during the Fenian cycle, with the hero Diarmid I mentioned in our previous lesson. While the love spot on his face was a more traditional curse, his elopement with his Lord Finn McCool's fiancée Grania was compelled by a geis. Grania, falling for Diarmid after being cursed by the love spot, tried to attain this love by imposing upon him a geis to run away with her. Thus, Diarmid had little choice but to betray Finn, else he suffered the consequence of breaking Grania's geis. It was a complicated decision. While Diarmid valued loyalty above all else, he also admired Grania's conviction in throwing away her future and status to be with him. His forgiveness extended to Finn, even during his death. So far, I've been making it seem as though geisha could be created by pretty much anyone, but beyond the realm of Celtic heroes and legends, their use spreads mainly to practiced mages. A rather grim application of them comes from the mage Rin Tosaka. During the Fifth Holy Grail War, she struggled with how to respectfully handle her sister Sakura, who was suffering due to the curse of Angra Mainyu discussed last time. When Rin's fellow master, Shiro Emiya, came to propose an alliance, she attempted to place upon him a geis to seal his loyalty. Should Shiro consent, Rin would have bound Shiro to comply with her every decision during the war. She could not force him into any specific behavior, but she could restrain him if he tried to defy her. Sakura's survival hinged upon this decision, as Rin initially decided to kill her. Shiro, bound by such a geis, would not be able to interfere and save his beloved. The use of geisha also appeared within the beasts of humanity, specifically Tiamat during the Age of Gods. Her frightening chaos tide, the Sea of Life, expands as a black mud capable of birthing children and corrupting life that touches it. The children born of the chaos tide are imposed with a geis on a cellular level, a contract through nitrogen that compels them to oppose humanity. Even servants corrupted by the chaos tide can find their saint grafts altered to abide by this amino geis. Because the tide can bring about life, this geis most certainly rivals Angra Mainyu's curse. Geisha have even been implemented to literally serve as contracts between mages in the form of documents called self-geis scrolls. While Celtic warriors would suffer and lose their strength by breaking a geis, mages using scrolls would instead bind their own magic crests as a geis's collateral. That's right, these agreements between mages are bound by their most precious commodity, guaranteeing loyalty, even in death as a magic crest is soul-bound. Self-geis scrolls are used in forming unbreakable alliances, and to suppress even the most treacherous magi. It goes without saying that mages do not take these contracts lightly. In the Great Holy Grail War in Trifus, the mage Kairi Shishigo offers signing a self-geis scroll in order to validate a temporary partnership with the Black Faction while fighting against Shiro Kotomine. In his case, the offering alone demonstrates loyalty, such that Fiore Forve Giga de Millennia agrees to the alliance without such extreme measures. The same cannot be said for everyone, however. In a completely different time, a mage representing the Reirokon family, contracted to the caster servant Paracelsus von Hohenheim, signs a self-geis scroll to validate an alliance with his enemy rider servant, the Pharaoh Ozymandias. It must be mentioned that this was not at all consensual, however. The master had very little choice in the matter, as Ozymandias could and would easily murder both him and his daughter Messiah if he refused to sign. Sadly, this is not the only instance of scrolls being signed under coercion. In fact, the most nefarious and disrespectful application of a self-geis scroll was forced under similar circumstances. Kiritsugu Emiya, rightfully named the Mage Killer, proved his title by using the conventions of Magi against them. To seal his victory in the Fourth Holy Grail War against his enemy Cainith El Malloy Archibald, he essentially made a mockery of the self-geis scroll. He had his assistant Maya severely wound and kidnap Cainith's lover, Solau. He then held Solau at gunpoint while giving Cainith the proposed scroll. In exchange for Cainith using all of his remaining command seals and ordering his servant Diarmid to kill himself, Kiritsugu vowed to forbid himself of any intention of harming Cainith or Solau for all eternity. Kiritsugu had already signed it, and all Cainith had to do was fulfill its conditions. Under immense pressure, Cainith was forced to decide between everything a mage stands for, his pursuit of Akasha, and the woman he loved. Trusting in the contract, he wasted all his command seals and betrayed Diarmuid's loyalty by robbing his servant of an honorable fight. For Solau, Kenneth threw away the war, his pride, and his purpose. Yet, this spared neither him nor his beloved. Certainly, Kiritsugu kept his end of the bargain, not intending to kill them himself, but nowhere in the contract were Kenneth and Solau's safety guaranteed. Instead, taking advantage of a false sense of security, Maya shot them dead on the spot without warning or mercy. On one end, it's fair to brand Kenneth a naive fool for not negotiating better terms during a war clearly stripped of its honor. However, it is also fair to say that Kiritsugu, despite coveting the Grail for world peace, had committed yet another grave sin. The anger he brought to his servant Artoria Pendragon was well earned, but Kiritsugu knew full well he was walking a path of bloodshed toward his ultimate goal. One could say Kiritsugu slandered the very practice he was raised into, but at the same time, one could also say that Kiritsugu's very behavior was perfectly in line for a mage. After all, the Mages Association is filled with betrayal, neatly tucked beneath a facade of academic prestige. Ironically, all mages are human, and it's simply a matter of how far they go to deny that. In summation, Gesha are cursed oaths, orders, and contracts established between mages and victims. They culturally hail from Celtic mythology, serving as a key component behind both the hubris and honor of brave warriors, but their use is clearly expanded to Magecraft at large. Gesha are often the most serious promises mages can make, putting their entire legacy on the line. But even then, the honor and sincerity behind these oaths is completely dependent upon the mage. For our next lesson, we shall delve into something more immediately recognizable. I cannot say how many lessons this will take, but this course would not be complete without covering the phenomena known as mystic eyes. In our previous lesson, I spoke of the Geis, a magecraft akin to curses that function as a binding, limitation, or agreement between mages. Today's lesson, however, shall be focused on something that has become quite popular and coveted among mages, the mystic eyes. On this topic, I have much to cover, from the many types of mystic eyes, where they come from, and how mages both acquire and exchange them. There is so much to discuss that I will be breaking the topic up into at least 2 different lessons, starting with the fundamentals before moving on to examples, and of course the infamous mystic eye collection train rail Zeppelin. I appreciate your patience as we go through this very unique and fascinating piece of the craft. Put bluntly, mystic eyes are special eyes that grant their owners powers they can use in manipulating the world. Practically speaking, they grant their owners spells that standard magecraft cannot accomplish alone. They exist as strange phenomena that occur both naturally and artificially. The cause of a pair of mystic eyes is a mutation in a mage's magic circuits. This means that mystic eyes are hereditary and can be passed on between generations. Oddly enough, this has led some families, such as the Nanaya demon hunters, to practice incest so they can better ensure their mystic eyes pass to their children. Other mages prefer artificially causing mutations in their magic circuits through a process similar to forging a magic crest. This obviously has its own merits over inbreeding, but generally speaking, only common mystic eyes, such as binding, charm, and whisper, can be created in this way. There are 2 exceptions to this rule. The Lehrman family, for instance, specializes in crafting mystic eyes by cutting gemstones. These eyes are not organic, but they do function properly regardless. Toko Aozaki, on the other hand, specializes in creating automaton puppets with tremendous realism. Her technique is so precise that she can effectively manufacture replicas of her own mystic eye, arming her puppets with the same skills she has. While artificially created eyes are quite common among mages, they often lack in comparison to the tremendous powers found in the eyes some rare mages are born with. The Mages Association ranks such powerful eyes using a noble color system. Exceptionally potent eyes shine gold and are classified as such. Jewel-ranked mystic eyes belong to beings and beasts from the Age of Gods, whereas rainbow-ranked eyes are strong enough to rival gods in their power. Oftentimes, such eyes prove too powerful for a mage, and are prone to running out of control. Mages with strong mystic eyes either need to train to harness them only when necessary, or otherwise find ways to restrict them. In that endeavor, mages have invented what are called mystic eye killers, a form of mystic code that mages can wear to weaken their eyes. Without them, keeping Magecraft a secret from the general masses would be nigh impossible. Even then, however, they can only do so much to hold back the most powerful of eyes. Another method of weakening mystic eyes is simply being aware of them. Mages who can recognize and understand the nature of a pair of mystic eyes gain a slight resistance to them. While their effects can never be negated this way, it can make the difference between life and death during a surprise encounter. Let us go over the different types of mystic eyes, starting with the most common and progressing toward the most powerful. First, there are the mystic eyes of binding. As the name implies, these eyes are capable of binding anyone they meet eyes with. It's a suggestion spell, causing victims to become momentarily paralyzed. Both Eliasville von Einsburn and the X-Clock Tower mage Barzan have these eyes. As I mentioned before, they are most effective on naive targets, given that trained magi can resist their effect. A more passive type, the Mystic Eyes of Charm, are able to compel others to find their owners sexually appealing. In function, their effects are remarkably similar to the love spot possessed by Diarmid Odubna, which in addition to being a curse, is classified as a mystic face skill, though that's far less common. Similarly, a handful of mystic eyes serve to compel victims to act in specific ways. For instance, the Mystic Eyes of Compulsion can forcibly control a target's body to obey commands, an effect similar to a master's command spells. Iskandar's Shadow Retainer in Body Double, the sister of Hephaestion, happens to have these very same mystic eyes. More commonly, however, we'll see the Mystic Eyes of Enchantment, which put victims into a state of hypnosis. Those possessing these eyes are Arcuate Brunstad, Nero Chaos, Alice Kuonji, and Toko Awazaki. More specifically, Alice and Toko only have this feature in their left eyes. In addition, the servant Suzuka Gozen has eyes with this ability, as well as a charm effect. With but a slight nuanced difference, we have the Mystic Eyes of Whisper. They also function hypnotically, but are far more subtle. Rather than directly taking control of their victims, these Mystic Eyes cause victims to believe unquestionably the words of their user. This allows mages like Ciel to plant suggestions in her victims' minds that can only be undermined through direct contradiction. As a member of the aforementioned Lehrman family, the mage Yvette can swap between 3 separate mystic eyes, each made artificially from gemstones. Her Malachite eye has the power to see emotions, allowing her to sense how a person is truly feeling. Her Eye of Iolite enhances her ability to sense the mana density of an area. It is especially useful for detecting ley lines. For offense, she has a mystic eye made from ruby. It is a mystic eye of flame, which causes objects in her vision to spontaneously combust. While there's genuine appeal to swapping eyes frequently to fit the situation, it is far from safe. Yvette runs the risk of losing her sanity, and to prevent this, she has had her brain modified over 50 times. I imagine some will find that more troublesome than it's worth. The following mystic eyes are far more rare, and by extension more potent than the kind mages can typically create artificially, such as the Mystic Eyes of Clear Sight. Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanova is watched over by her shadowy familiar V. Contracted to the Russian Empire, V uses his mystic eyes to gaze upon people to discern their secrets, and upon objects to determine their weak points. This is especially effective on bounded fields. As a servant, Anastasia can have V use the eyes as a noble phantasm, capable of creating weak points in an otherwise flawless defense. The Greek goddess Medusa is widely known for her mystic eyes of petrification, otherwise titled Cybele. While they might seem similar to the eyes of binding, Medusa's eyes are on an entirely different level, absorbing the life force of anyone she stares upon, in addition to turning them to stone. These eyes are so iconic and deadly that Medusa often keeps them covered by a blindfold, Breaker Gorgon, which serves as a mystic eye killer. When settling into a more contemporary life at the Emiya family, she uses a pair of glasses crafted by Toko Awazaki to achieve a weaker effect more stylishly. Balor, the Celtic god of darkness, the grandfather of Cuchulainn, possessed an unnamed type of mystic eyes that could cause death to anyone he looked upon. It is thought that these eyes were the predecessor of the equally terrifying mystic eyes of death perception possessed by Shiki Ryogi and Shiki Tono. In either case, the owners are capable of seeing death lines or death points, seams in the fabric of existence. If all things have an origin, they must also possess an end. Upon seeing the innate structural flaws of all things, Shiki can sever those points, bringing death even to concepts and beings previously considered immortal. It should go without saying that without training, this ability can be both overwhelming and extremely dangerous. In the case of Shiki Ryogi, even her attempts to put her own eyes out could not suppress the sensation. Only after being rigorously trained by Toko Awazaki does she learn to manifest the eyes at will. The younger Shiki Tono, on the other hand, was given mystic eye killers in the form of glasses akin to Medusa's. Toko first made the glasses, but her sister Aoko enhanced them so that he could strive for a normal life. As expected, these eyes have most certainly received the rainbow classification from the clock tower, as they very much rival the power of gods. Manifesting from her family's psychic talents, Asagami Fujino was born with mystic eyes of distortion. They allow her to bend and twist points in space regardless of mass or magical properties. Be it bones, buildings, or the trajectory of airborne objects, Fujino can bend them all to her will. There are also mystic eyes known as glam sight, or fairy eyes. The mage Norma Goodfellow possesses fairy eyes that universally enhance her vision, allowing her to see swift movements normally undetectable to normal humans. In a more obvious application, Wills Pelham Codrington, a clock tower instructor, has a set of fairy eyes his father purchased for him that grant him the ability to see fairies. Ironically, it was a specific fairy, Faye, that killed his father for involving innocent lives in Magecraft research. Regardless, fascinated by her, Wills winds up leaving the realm of man to be with her in a process somewhat akin to journeying to Avalon, a realm that now exists only in the reverse side of the world. The genius swordsman Miyamoto Musashi possesses the Heavenly Eye, which grants her the ability of condensing infinite possibilities into one. In effect, she can see a certain outcome in her mind and render that outcome inevitable, specifically as it relates to her martial arts. For example, if she desires to slice into an enemy at a specific angle, she can see beyond all other possible outcomes to ensure her vision comes true. An almost identical effect can be observed by mages who have the mystic eyes of reversion. Specifically, the A-Team master Ophelia Famersalone can invoke her right eye to see the various possibilities her enemies can take, and even cull those possibilities to ensure a certain outcome. If there's any difference between the two, it's that Musashi's eyes make her vision the only outcome, whereas Ophelia's eye strips away all the outcomes that might benefit her opponent. One can say these are a form of predicting the future, and while it definitely seems similar, that ability belongs to an entirely different set of eyes, called the Mystic Eyes of Premonition. They allow the mage Trisha Fellows to see glimpses of the future, including her own demise. This is in direct contrast to the Mystic Eyes of Retrocognition, which can see the past. A variant of these eyes are the Mystic Eyes of Transience, possessed by Karabo Frempton. They allow him to see fragments of the past as bubbles in theoretical sea foam. Over the years he's had the eyes, they've caused him to lose track of his own memories, lost in the sea of visions they give him. Unlike normal retrocognition, these eyes let him carry events of the past into the present. For example, he could blindly slash the air in a room, wait for someone to enter that room, and repeat the slash as a form of unobservable attack. A bizarre case of time-altering mystic eyes were found in Mitsuru Kamekura, a serial bomber who had the ability of precognition. His right eye could see the future, or rather a potential future, whereas his left eye could see the events leading up to that future. In practice, he could set up bombs that would detonate without causing any casualties. This proved useful for making threats and profiting without killing anyone. Ultimately, this ability of his was killed off when Shiki Ryogi used her eyes to thwart his. Dr. Heartless, the former faculty head of modern Magecraft, once had his heart stolen by fairies. His mystic eyes, the eyes of usurpation, allow him to effectively hijack the eyes of anyone else. He can see vicariously through them, as well as take control of their powers. The dangerous applications of this will be explored in our next lesson. Prior to acquiring these eyes, he possessed the mystic eyes of finding, which are now possessed by Hishiri Arashino, an officer of the Department of Policies. Just as the name suggests, her eyes can single out and locate things that are lost. The mage Rhinus El Malloy Archisword has an undocumented type of mystic eyes that are useful in analyzing traces of mana. Sadly, a side effect of these eyes is that they react harshly to dense mana, causing a burning sensation. In effect, this renders her allergic to high concentrations of mana. Lastly, the master Tatsumi Kitano has a pair of undocumented mystic eyes that allow him to halt anything in his field of view from moving. This even includes looking at others through the viewfinder of a camera. This time, I will spare us a summary of this lesson in favor of the next, as it will continue the same topic. In our previous lesson, I provided an introduction on mystic eyes, explaining various examples of them. Given their many uses, it is no wonder why mages seek out mystic eyes, both natural and artificial. While I mentioned mages are typically born with them, and they transfer hereditarily, I did not speak much of the hidden market through which mages buy and sell mystic eyes to one another. Thus, today's lesson is on the infamous mystic eye collection train Rail Zeppelin. We will speak of how it works, as well as about a particularly dangerous incident that occurred around it. In essence, the Rail Zeppelin is a train that first traveled northern Europe, and on its various stops would pick up mages who had received a formal invitation to board. Obviously, such candidates are typically chosen for having a vested interest in either selling or buying mystic eyes. Given the value of these eyes, however, transactions are handled via auction, forcing mages to compete for their prize. Certainly, this is a wonderful opportunity for mages, but you're likely wondering who would curate this process. Well, initially, the train was managed by a dead apostle named Rose N. Some suspected that this may even be the infamous Rita Rose N, a superior yet arrogant vampire known for bathing in blood on a nightly basis. It is believed that her penchant for artistry fueled her desire to curate the train and bask in the splendor of rare mystic eyes. However, the original manager of the train is no longer present, giving us no way of knowing whether they were Rita herself or another of the Rose N clan. Narrative on her disappearance is also vague. Accounts state that the mage Toko Aozaki and her familiar Lug Beowulf once boarded the train on a journey through Europe. During this time, Toko battled against the manager, and collateral damage destroyed the train itself. Since then, the former manager has been absent, instead leaving the train's care to the deputy manager, a shadowy emanation left behind in her stead. This representative had the train rebuilt, and continues to curate the event as the only entity capable of extracting a person's mystic eyes. Even so, the deputy manager is not alone in this process. Currently, the train's conductor is a grim individual named Rodin. The one in charge of the auction specifically is a woman named Leandra. At any given moment, Leandra has a handful of mystic eyes implanted into her arm, though you wouldn't know just looking at her sleeves. She understands the drama of mages, and typically refrains from interfering in their devious ploys to murder one another. That said, she will get involved if external forces pose a threat to those on board, attempting to protect passengers from anything but themselves. After being rebuilt, the Rail Zeppelin has expanded its route through all of Europe, including Britain. The train itself is made up of 12 cars. The main car, Ricapello, is one of the 3 cars that provide locomotion. In addition, there is a car for dining, a lobby, guests, and freight. For self-defense, the main car Ricapello is equipped with a spiritual mystic eye projector, which uses the spiritual nature regression-type lens Rose Eye to tremendously amplify the power of mystic eyes consumed by it. As expected, the Rail Zeppelin has been a host to a fair number of auctions, but none quite as troublesome as one involving a mage by the name of Dr. Heartless. Just as the name implies, he no longer possesses a conventional heart, as his had been stolen by fairies. Before Waver Velvet took on the role of Lord Elmaloy II and began teaching at the Clock Tower as head of the Faculty of Modern Magecraft, Dr. Heartless headed the department despite not being a lord at all. Rather than prestige, he earned the position through merit, being well versed in not only modern magecraft, but also zoology, botany, mineralogy, metamorphism, and spiritual evocation. He was a contemporary of Marisbury Animosphere, and the two mages took great interest in the Fuyuki Holy Grail Wars. They split, however, when Marisbury learned that the Grail had been corrupted by Angermainu and could no longer work as a wish-granting device. But Heartless held his interest due to his fascination with summoning servants. While investigating this process, he made use of his highly dangerous mystic eyes of usurpation, which allow him to hijack the mystic eyes of others. Essentially, he can see vicariously through their eyes and control them as if they were his own. The most tragic victim of these eyes was a church investigator by the name of Carabo Frampton. He was tasked with looking into a series of London murders that, ironically, he himself played a part in. You see, Carabo possessed mystic eyes of transience, which could both see glimpses of the past and also bring past effects into the present. That last ability proved to be a dangerous murder weapon, in that they could be used to take a past occurrence, such as a slash into thin air, and bring it to the present right as an unsuspecting victim occupied that space. The result? Near spontaneous decapitation of the victim. Naturally, this left behind no clues, only a series of headless corpses. While Carabo's eyes were responsible for the murders, he himself did not willingly commit them. The true culprit was Dr. Heartless, using his own eyes to commandeer Carabo's. His motive? To preserve the heads of the deceased, amassing a collection of mystic eyes he could channel at will. Preserving these heads came about through the use of a pocket dimension of sorts. Heartless, who lacked a heart in his chest cavity, instead had a fissure connecting to another dimension of infinite number space where he could hide the heads. The extra eyes helped Heartless investigate the Grail War and formulate a plan to replicate its ability to summon heroic spirits. The two things Heartless needed to pull this off were a former master of the Grail War and the ley lines resulting from a child of Einash, though I suppose that needs to be explained in detail. Einash is the name of a living forest that goes by many names, including the Demon of Schwarzwald, the Thinking Forest, and the Predator Forest. It qualifies as one of the 27 Dead Apostle ancestors, keeping itself alive for over 800 years by training the life of those foolish enough to enter it. The forest grows a fruit that drips blood when ripened. The blood that flows down germinates the earth like seeds, sprouting smaller vampiric forests called Children of Einash. Heartless realized that if he could bring the Rail Zeppelin and a child of Einash together, he could connect their ley lines to that of Fuyuki City's Greater Grail, resulting in an imitation Holy Grail. Then, with Waver Velvet, a survivor of the previous war, present on the train, Heartless could use Waver's bond with the heroic spirit Iskandar to summon a ghost liner, which more or less functions like a servant. Putting this plan into motion, Heartless stole the catalyst Waver used to summon Iskandar and used it as bait to get Waver to board the Rail Zeppelin. Once aboard, Heartless teleported a child of Einash using the void in his chest, bringing all of the components he needed together in a single location, allowing him to summon a servant of the class he names Faker. Fitting of the class, Faker was Iskandar's body double. A twin sister to Hephaestion, one of Iskandar's generals, Faker served as Iskandar's shadow, never having a name of her own. As a result, despite being a valuable asset to Iskandar, she was never officially included among his army. In fact, she bore resentment toward the army, and was thus not included in the Ionian Hetairoi. Having finally succeeded in summoning a servant of his own, Heartless covered his tracks. He disguised himself as Kaules Forvej Yugidamillennia, but feared his cover would be blown by one of the train's passengers, Trisha Fellows, who possessed mystic eyes of premonition. Thankfully for him, Heartless's old victim Carabo Frampton had also boarded the train to auction off his eyes of transience, which had started to erode his own memories. Just like before with the killings in London, Heartless tapped into Carabo's eyes to assassinate Trisha. Amazingly, however, Trisha was able to envision her own death, and at the last moment, hid her head away from Heartless. Consumed by greed, Heartless conspired with the mage Yvette to try and win the auction for Carabo's eyes. Essentially, he stretched his ambitions too far, leading a trail of activity that allowed Waver to deduce the truth of his involvement. Once outed for his crimes, Dr. Heartless attempted to escape with Faker's protection, calling forth the Child of Einash once more to attack the train. With the auction essentially annulled, Carabo was given back his eyes, and he used them to combat Faker, bringing about slashes from just moments before to injure her. The train's remaining mages teamed up to help Olga Marie Animesphere cast a spell, sending fire down upon the Einash branches. To finish off the Child of Einash, Leandra loaded the Mystic Eye projector to send a tremendous blast of energy into the forest's core. Lastly, Waver's confidant Gray removed the seals on her divine construct Rongo Minyad to counter Faker's chariot. In the end, however, Dr. Heartless managed to escape alive, and the conflict was written off as a battle between dead apostles. Karabo was thought to have died during the fight. While this was definitely a bizarre incident, it proved to be nothing the rail Zeppelin could not endure. It continues to operate, drawing in mages who seek to profit from the auctions. For example, the mage Galvarosos Gladio, the head of his family, poured a fortune into acquiring mystic eyes of future sight. Just like Karabo's eyes, however, these proved to be more of a curse than a blessing. These eyes could only show Scladio a single future, that of his own demise, looping endlessly. As a result, he had them removed, a testament to the potential downsides of a mage's greed. All things considered, the same can be said for anyone trying to purchase their way to success. In summation, the Rail Zeppelin is the only place where mages can effectively extract and sell their naturally born mystic eyes. It is one of the few ways in which mages can commodify the craft, gaining new and interesting abilities via wealth. Managed by the remains of a dead apostle and a mysterious auctioneer, the Rail Zeppelin continues to tour all of Europe, only appearing to those specifically invited to join in on the auctions. For our next lesson, I will speak of another commodified aspect of Magecraft: mystic codes, or artifacts imbued with magical properties. In our previous lesson, I spoke of how mages exchange mystic eyes via the auction train Rail Zeppelin. Given that mystic eyes are treated as a commodity among mages, I believe it's appropriate for us to transition to another heavily commodified aspect of the craft, that being mystic codes. Similar to mystic eyes, mystic codes are artifacts that grant their users magical potential they may not otherwise possess. They are often used in tandem with a mage's natural abilities, so it's important we cover them in a lesson of their own. Basically, a mystic code is a tool or weapon designed by and meant to work in tandem with Magecraft. They can range from things like a protective garment or perhaps a gun that channels mana. Some amplify a mage's potential, while others are specialized and have a very specific function. Certain families treat mystic codes like their own magic crests, passing them down from generation to generation while making improvements. These are called supreme mystic codes. In general, though, a code's potential lies in the creativity and innovation of its maker, making it hard to bundle mystic codes into rigid categories. There are enough unique cases, often being catered to a specific mage's style, that once again I feel it is best to teach through example. By exploring the different types of codes that already exist, perhaps you might find the inspiration to design your own. Let's start with perhaps the most dangerous codes, the 7 superweapons of Atlas, specifically Black Barrel. I'll keep this brief as I've already covered Black Barrel in my lesson on Atlas, but it is essentially a conceptual rifle that imposes limited lifespans on otherwise immortal creatures. It is known as a gun that kills gods, and has for the most part been sealed away. That is, except for the barrel replica, which is actually used by the Atlas alchemist Sion Eltnam Itlasia. Taking the shape of a CZ-75 handgun, barrel replica damages its targets relative to their natural lifespan. The longer the target's lifespan, the more effective replica shots become. To use its strongest form, barrel replica obelisk, Sion must make use of her other mystic code called Etherlight, which is passed down her family. While taking the shape and function of a whip, Etherlight is an artificial nervous system that can penetrate a target's skin and read their thoughts and memories. It is a tool that can discharge electricity to kill, or invade the nervous system for its owner's benefit. When it comes to the replica obelisk, Sion uses Etherlight to ground herself to resist the gun's recoil. More humble is the Salamander's Glove, utilized by Azaka Kokto, a fledgling mage who can surprisingly use Magecraft without having magic circuits. She has an inborn ability to cause spontaneous combustion, and so her mentor, Toko Aozaki, gifted her a pair of salamander skin gloves that amplify her otherwise weak output. The gloves, in addition to her understanding of Magecraft through music, give a mostly ordinary girl like Azaka an advantage over vampiric enemies. Another mystic code designed to compensate for a mage's lack of ability is the Book of the False Attendant. Shinji Mato, a completely inept mage, insisted in participating in the Fifth Holy Grail War, even though it was his adopted sister Sakura the Grail chose to bestow with command spells. To grant Shinji the ability to control Sakura's servant, Medusa, Zoken Mato modified a book of magical contracts into a surrogate command spell. Essentially, a single one of Sakura's spells was implanted in the book, granting Shinji temporary control of her servant. While this book let Shinji issue orders to Medusa, it could not completely make up for his lack of magical energy. As such, Medusa is far weaker under his command, and the book itself is quite fragile, capable of being burned to nullify their false contract. In addition to books, many mages prefer the use of cigarettes and cigars for mystic codes. Different brands are made with different abilities, from constructing defensive spells to establishing bounded fields. The mage Waver Velvet, upon taking over the name Lord Elmaloy II, chose cigars as his mystic code because, to him, they seemed more appropriate for a lord. Technically speaking, the jewel Magecraft used by the Tosaka and Edelfelt families count as mystic codes. By imbuing jewels with mana, mages like Rin can cast powerful spells in rapid succession. Her father, Tokiyomi in particular, constructed a jeweled staff with a heavily charged tip he could invoke to cast devastating fire spells with ease. The Azoth dagger he gifted to his protege Kirei worked in a very similar manner. Rather than a weapon for cutting, the Azoth dagger's true use was in storing mana to be invoked at a later point in time. It was crafted from precious Tosaka heirloom jewels and should have been accepted honorably. Foolishly, however, Kirei used it as a traditional blade to murder Tokiyomi, and he even had the gall to pass the blade onto Tokiyomi's daughter, Rin. In a bit of karmic justice, however, Rin spent many years charging the dagger and entrusted it to Shiro, who used it to kill Kirei once and for all. This is impressive, considering the Tosaka's Azoth dagger is actually a replica of an original carried by Paracelsus von Hohenheim. The original, called the Sword of Paracelsus, magic sword of the element user, had embedded into its hilt a Philosopher's Stone, granting Paracelsus the ability to turn lead into gold, as well as cure illness. Debatably a much more dangerous weapon is Froggerok, gouging sword of the war god. Perhaps more fittingly, it is also called Answerer, that which comes later cuts first. It certainly doesn't appear as a traditional sword, and that is because the blade is there to conceptually cut time. This mystic code is the ultimate counterattack, designed to throw an enemy's strongest attack back at them. Though it can only be used after an attack is launched, which you might think would endanger its user. However, when Froggerok does activate, it rewrites causality to ensure it strikes first, sending a needle-thin blast into the enemy before they can even launch their attack. The stronger the attack, the stronger the counterattack. Thanks to this, Bazette Fraga McRemitz, a mere hunter of the Mages Association, can use Froggerok to defeat servants, despite being a human. It is a fitting weapon for her, as she hails from Ireland, where Froggerok was originally the short sword of the Celtic sea god Manannán. This means that it is technically a noble phantasm being used as a mystic code, leading many to underestimate its potential. Those who are aware of the danger, however, are caught in a stalemate, unable to launch their greatest attacks out of fear of retaliation. The different shrouds kept by the Holy Church are considered mystic codes. In particular, Kirei's daughter Karen Hortensia possesses the Shroud of Magdalene, a red cloth that can bind men. While this can be useful, it does come with a caveat. The men entrapped by the shroud cannot be harmed, else the binding go loose. Thus, it cannot be used offensively. On a side note, the cloak worn by heroic spirit Emiya is also made from a holy shroud. Certainly one of the most bizarre mystic codes belongs to Kabak Alcatraz, a mage who used magical research to become a vampire. He's been missing for over a century, but some suspect that he lives on in the mystic code Mr. Cell Phone, a functioning flip phone made by Keisher Zelrech Schweinorg. While most certainly a product of Magecraft, Mr. Cell Phone functions just like any other mobile phone, despite housing a man who's been alive for over 800 years. Astolfo, one of the 12 paladins of Charlemagne, got his hands on a number of mystic codes during his lifetime, all of which function as his noble phantasms as a servant. One of them is Casseur de la Justice, Destruction Declaration, a witch's book that renders him immune to modern Magecraft. La Justia, the Benevolent Witch, also gave Astolfo La Black Luna, magic flute that calls panic. It is a hunting horn that, when blown, releases an explosion of sound that destroys the land around it, even chasing away monsters as strong as harpies. It changes both size and shape so that Astolfo can wear it around his belt when not using it. Trap of Argalia, down with a touch, was a golden lance belonging to Argalia, a prince of Cathay. Its magical properties ensured that its strikes would always bring targets to their knees, allowing Argalia to win many jousting matches. Astolfo took possession of it and later handed it off to his cousin Bradamante. The lance strikes not primarily to kill, though it certainly can, but rather to turn an enemy into spirit form below the knees, causing them to fall. Quite cleverly, the mage Eris Utsumi made her own hair forelocks into a mystic code that functions as a communication device. Sometimes a mystic code can serve to augment a mage's physical abilities rather than deficiencies in their craft. Such is the case for wheelchair-bound Fiore Forve Giga de Millennia and her code, Bronze Link Manipulators. Collectively, the manipulators are a spider-like exoskeleton that provides her mobility and weaponry. Its arms are named after Roman gods and can be invoked to deflect projectiles, crush obstacles, or fire bullets. Another multi-purpose mystic code is Add, though it was created long ago by King Arthur's sister Morgan Le Fay to seal the divine lands Rongo Minyad. Sir Kay of the Round Table served as the basis for Add's personality, and over time, Add found himself in the possession of Grey, a descendant of Arthur. She has Add transform between various weapons, such as a scythe, hammer, bow, and shield. Most importantly, however, Add can release the seal on Rongo Minyad, allowing Grey to wield the destructive spear in battle. Speaking of Morgan Le Fay, she once carried a golden dagger, known as Erosion, penetrating blade of gold. Fitting for a manipulating witch, Morgan used it to sever the connection between a person's basic components, that being their mind, soul, and body. Mystic codes are not simply limited to the physical world, they can also exist within the Mooncell's simulated world, Seraph. In one of its many Holy Grail wars, the servant nursery rhyme unleashed a monster known as the Jabberwock from Lewis Carroll's famous poem. In the tale, the Jabberwock can only be defeated by a legendary Vorpal blade, and so competitors Hakuno Kishinami and Rani VIII team up to create one from malachite. This blade is a one-use mystic code made exclusively to weaken the Jabberwock in combat. I mentioned before that mystic codes can be passed down as heirlooms, and one of the better examples is Volumen Hydrargyrum, Marrow of the Moon Spirit, possessed by Cainith El Malloy Archibald. It is a composite fluid of mana and mercury that can be shaped and controlled at will. It serves as Cainith's perfect weapon, his figurative sword and shield. Various commands put the mercury into different modes of action. One form, for instance, restores the mercury to its true weight. Its automated defense mode allows it to remain in a small mass that follows him around as a bodyguard. To respond to threats, the mass can shape into sharp spikes, whips, and other blades, and its shape can change into that of a barrier to protect Cainith from oncoming attacks. It also has an automated search function that works by spreading itself thin into arms that explore an area while looking for living things. The Hydrargyrum's greatest weakness is that, due to the mercury, it can only detect enemies through vibrations in the air. In other words, sound and movement. Thus, if a mage like Kiritsugu Emiya can slow his heartbeat and breathing, the mercury will not detect him as a living being. After Cainith was killed in the Fourth Holy Grail War, this mystic code was passed on to Waver when he became Lord El Malloy II. With it, he assisted Rhinus El Malloy Archisort in reprogramming the mercury to function as a multi-purpose maid golem named Trimao. She acts as Rhinus's personal attendant and bodyguard. Of course, Cainith's defeat came at the hands of Kiritsugu Emiya, the mage killer. Or rather, it was Kiritsugu's mystic code, the Thompson Contender, that decided their battle. While it looks like the kind of gun one can purchase, Kiritsugu's Thompson Contender was modified into a unique spellcasting pistol that only mages can fully utilize. While a spellcasting firearm is certainly useful, Thompson is most deadly when combined with Kiritsugu's origin bullets, shells made from his ribs, inheriting his origin of severing and binding. To a mage, they can cut and rearrange their magic circuits, permanently incapacitating a mage should they manage to survive at all. Like many of the weapons described so far, the stronger the mage, the harsher their rebound. Returning to a more traditional code, we have Prelati's Spellbook, textbook of the Sunken Spiral Castle. Despite the name of its translator, François Prelati, the book's original text comes from Urlier, the lost city written about by H.P. Lovecraft. Bound in moist human skin, the spellbook contains horrifying knowledge of the outer god Cthulhu. It is a mystic code that summons nightmarish tentacle familiars, and sadly it came into possession of the anti-hero Gilles de Rais, who used it to torture and murder children. Lastly, I want to talk about the more iconic mystic codes made by the sorcerer Zelrech. Most famously, there is the Jeweled Sword, a blade that draws infinite mana from parallel worlds. Such a sword can only exist due to Zelrech possessing the true magic Kaleidoscope. Normally, it is meant to be possessed exclusively by Zelrech himself, but he also left the blueprints to recreate it with the Tosaka family. Thus, Shiro Emiya, using his tracing Magecraft, was able to help Reen and Iliasfil project a copy of the blade. More obscure are definitely the Kaleidosticks, Ruby and Sapphire. Perhaps a sign of Zelrech's refined tastes, these wands transform their users into magical girls, harnessing their ode to assist in firing energy blasts, forming shields, and performing other combat functions. When strange anomalies known as class cards began to appear, Zelrech designed the wands to be capable of invoking their power by installing them into their users. Similar to Ad, Ruby and Sapphire have their own personalities and can act independent of their owners. Admittedly, this is both helpful and annoying beyond compare. In summation, the term Mystic Code refers to all the physical tools mages design for primary and supplemental use. They can be used to amplify a mage's strengths, compensate for their shortcomings, embody a family's legacy, and perform all manner of unique functions. Among mages of different abilities and techniques, mystic codes are a great equalizer. Of course, they should always be approached with caution, as most are quite dangerous. Staying on the theme of weapons, our next lesson will be about divine constructs, weapons forged by the planet from the wishes of mankind. In our previous lesson, I spoke of mystic codes, the various tools and weapons that mages use to channel or supplement their magecraft. To remain on the topic of various trinkets and relics, I feel that it would help to speak of a much more powerful type of weapon, the divine construct. It takes the idea of crafting an item to an entirely new level, as these constructs are not merely forged by man for their own use, but rather forged by the planet itself for mankind's collective wishes. All in all, it is a far more enigmatic process, and while the average mage will likely never encounter a divine construct in person, simply knowing what our planet is capable of producing is far worth the time it takes to learn of it. To reiterate in the simplest terms, our planet Earth has energy and a consciousness called Gaia. Gaia acts to protect the planet and its inhabitants, which includes humans. Ironically, however, humans present one of the greatest threats to the planet, and to mediate this discrepancy, Gaia split to incorporate a second consciousness we call Alaya. Essentially, Alaya takes the form of humanity's collective unconscious, our collective will to survive. It is from Alaya that we have both the Counterforce and Counter-Guardian systems. In addition, Alaya is the source of power for gods and divine spirits. Since their inception, humans have often relied on belief, myth, and superstition to explain life's greatest mysteries. What is life? Why are we here? What happens when we die? The imagining of gods has helped provide answers to these questions in most every civilization throughout history. Responding to that collective worship, Alaya reacts by birthing and empowering those gods to exist in a tangible form. In that regard, there is no true god, but rather all gods exist in proportion to the amount of human worship they receive. Divine constructs in relation are armaments made and used by the gods. They are tools or weapons crafted either directly by a god, or born from the same human worship that gives gods their power. While both history and mythology are filled with legendary weapons, only some of them possess this divine quality, placing them on a higher tier of destructive might. Because of this, even mages who can envision and project legendary weapons cannot faithfully replicate the might of divine constructs. It's worth mentioning that the formation of divine constructs surpasses the temporal structure in which they're historically introduced. For instance, the prototype of all divine constructs is the sword belonging to Mars, the Greek and Roman god of war. Despite there being mythologies much older than in ancient Greece, this war god's sword, known as Photon Ray, was initially used to combat the Titan Altera, who invaded Earth long ago. Sadly, this being, the Scourge of God, was able to defeat Mars and claim Photon Ray for herself. The sword's blade consists of 3 colored bands of light that, when invoked, are capable of destroying all existence on Earth. Needless to say, the Titan's possession of this blade nearly ended our world. That is, if not for the prowess of a different divine construct. Excalibur, the sword of promised victory, is considered the strongest of all holy swords, crystallized within the planet from humanity's wishes for salvation. In other words, it is the embodiment of hope. While this divine sword is most famous in the hands of King Arthur, it was first forged and entrusted to the fairies, only reaching Artoria's hands through the efforts of Vivian, the Lady of the Lake. It was thanks to Excalibur's light that the Titan Altera was ultimately defeated. Functionally, it is a sword that amplifies its user's mana, channeling it into a destructive beam of light. The effect is even greater in the hands of warriors like Artoria, who were born with the factor of the dragon. Just like Arthur herself, however, Excalibur is vulnerable to corruption. It has an evil attribute more akin to Artoria's sister Morgana. In this form, Excalibur Morgan is no less powerful, but instead unleashes a blackened beam. There exists potentially an even stronger form of the blade in a parallel world in which the famous King Arthur is male, as legends typically describe. Its appearance is slightly different from our world's Excalibur, and possesses another layer of power held back by the restraints of the Round Table. Essentially, this Excalibur can only reach its full potential when approved by the 13 Knights of the Round Table, each releasing a seal on the blade to ensure it is used for the good of the planet. King Arthur also possesses a second divine construct known as Rungominiad. In its proper form, Rungominiad is a tower, or pillar of light, that holds together our world and its reverse side. Artoria Pendragon uses the tower, manifested as a holy lance that can conjure a light of destruction from the heavens. This spear is also limited by the restraints of the Round Table, and can only be invoked when at least 7 restraints are lifted. The use of divine constructs was not merely limited to the king. One of her most cherished knights, Lancelot, possessed the sword Erendite, the unfading light of the lake that, like Excalibur itself, had been protected by fairies. In fact, it is a counterpart blade to Excalibur, and can be used similarly to defeat entire armies. Sir Lancelot, however, harnesses the blade's light to perform Erendite Overload, which concentrates it into a single slash. While those weapons were forged in the waters of the planet, many are the direct product of specific gods. For instance, the various armaments crafted by the Olympian blacksmith Hephaestus. He's responsible for Zeus's lightning bolts, as well as Aegis Eclipse, the bow made for the superhuman hunter Orion. Perhaps more impressive is the shield Hephaestus made for the Greek hero Achilles. It is called Achilleus Cosmos, the miniature world enclosed by the azure sky. It functions as a bounded field, reproducing Achilles' world into a miniature form to defend against attacks under the motto, "To oppose this shield is to make an enemy of the entire world." The sea god Poseidon's trident also qualifies as a divine construct. At its full power, the trident can control all authorities of the sea, but as of late, it is used in a much more limited capacity by the warrior Canis of the Argonauts. Moving on from Greek mythology, we enter the Celtic sphere with Argitlam, the silver arm of Nuada, the Celtic god of war in the sea from the Tuatha De Danann. During one of Chaldea's exploits, this arm is fashioned into a prosthetic for Sir Bedivere of the Round Table, allowing him to conceal the Excalibur he refused to return to the Lady of the Lake. Some of the most powerful deities in the world have come from Mesopotamian myth, and many of their armaments found their way into Gilgamesh's Gate of Babylon. His most destructive weapon is by far Ea, the Sword of Rupture, named after the god of water, wisdom, and incantations. It was forged long before swords had their traditional shape, making it more equivalent to a wand than a blade. It was created as a weapon that only Gilgamesh himself could use, and what should be its blade are instead 3 rotating segments that represent the heavens, earth, and underworld respectively. Functionally, Ea is a key to unleashing a devastating attack called Enuma Elish, the star of creation that split heaven and earth. The blade distorts space-time, annihilating the fabric of worlds. This destruction can only be partially negated by a blast from Excalibur, and the only means of truly defending it are contained within Excalibur's scabbard, Avalon. In all other cases, there is simply no escaping Ea's wrath. To contain Gilgamesh's rampant authority and return him to the gods' favor, the gods created Enkidu, the Chains of Heaven. Despite being a living being with autonomy of their own, Enkidu counts as a divine construct that can transform into literal chains that specialize in binding divine beings. The chains remain as part of Gilgamesh's arsenal. Though when manifested independently, Enkidu can use them to invoke their own form of Enuma Elish to protect humans. Adding to his collection, Gilgamesh also possesses Ig Alima, green field cutting through the Thousand Mountains. It is one of two swords wielded by the Sumerian deity Zababa. Its size is so massive that it can carve into thousands of mountains at a time. Naturally, Gilgamesh himself cannot lift it as such. Instead, he utilizes the Gate of Babylon to drop or shoot the blades as a gargantuan projectile. Simply by being in the environment, the sword acts as a bridge, ramp, or battlefield all its own. Zababa's other blade was known as Sul Sagana, the horizon of dawn that purifies the seas. Rather than a mere sword, Sul Sagana emits molten flames and beams in addition to cleaving opponents. In that sense, it is more furnace than sword, capable of burning away even the oceans. Similar to Enkidu, another living construct happens to be Gugulana, the Bull of Heaven. It is a colossal familiar granted to Ishtar by her father Anu after being humiliated by Gilgamesh. Clad in storms, this bull brought flood and famine to Uruk for 7 years, until being slain by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. From Sumer to Norse mythology, we have Levitain, sword like a sun that becomes a calamity. It is a composite weapon made from combining the giant Surtur's flaming sword with Freyr's Sword of the Sun and weapons from Loki. Despite being sealed by Surtur's wife, Sinmara, Levitain can torch both life forms and entire textures from our world. More iconic is Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor. This hammer, crafted by the dwarven brothers Brokor and Sindri, can be used for melee attacks as well as channeling thunder. It is wielded by Beatrice Flowerchild, a doll of the Ainsworth family, via a Berserker class card. While useful, taking advantage of this weapon comes with significant risk, for if Thor's divine core within gets fractured, it will wreak havoc on the world on the same destructive level as Ragnarok. Lastly, we have divine constructs from Indian mythology. The two rivaling warriors of the Mahabharata, Arjuna and Karna, each possess a construct of great renown. Arjuna was given Pashupata, raised hand of the destructive god, by Shiva, the greater god of destruction and creation. Rather than decimating entire armies at once, Pashupata's destruction targets individuals and delivers to them moksha, the release from the cycle of rebirth, upon being judged. Karna's construct is Vasavi Shakti, O sun, abide to death, a spear of light bestowed upon him by the thunder god Indra. While Indra first tricked Karna into giving up his armor to protect Arjuna, Indra respected Karna's nobility and in recompense granted him the spear. Vasavi Shakti stands taller than Karna himself, with a massive tip that could not be wielded by a normal human. While he never invoked the spear's true name in life, Karna is able to use it as a noble phantasm when discarding his armor to unleash a lightning strike capable of killing even the gods. In summation, divine constructs are powerful weapons crafted either by the gods themselves or the planet using humanity's collective unconscious. Just like the gods, divine constructs have fallen out of prominence as mankind moved into a technological era. Clearly, though, our Earth is quite a remarkable planet. But it would be foolish to glorify our humble rock while ignoring the merits of other celestial bodies. Thus, our next lesson shall cover the planets, stars, and the mysterious entities known as types or ultimate ones. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to Otaku Daikun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all our anime lore, discussions, and Let's Play content.
you can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or a YouTube membership, all of which come with benefits like spicy exclusive vids and early access.
As always, celebrate your fandom. I want to give a special shout out to all my $10 and up supporters. Video Gamer 75, Dante Pendragon, Stephen Elak, Samuel Gersten, The Nonchalant Ostrich, Otaku Mom, Jens Bauman, Mystic Samurai 1983, Lord Ormagoden, Free Brick, Alexis Yukio Gomez Yamato, Link Pendrago, Observer Bellis, James Hewitt, Uncanny EXP, Zamas Autonomous, Scout, Yuki Eidos, Crow Kalem, Saul Soto, Tristan Riggin, Major, Caitlin P., Sogai CH, Vladimir Rovna, The Taz 96, Jonathan Padua, Kengo X77, Hersha of E-Rated Hands, Alester Bernadotte, and Akakaze Yume. Thank you all so much.